Normandy, June 7, 1944, dawn. The air still smells of the Channel, salt, diesel, and the faint burn of cordite. A low fog clings to the hedgerows, muting the sound of engines somewhere beyond the next field. On a narrow country lane near Villers-Bocage, the crew of a German Tiger tank listens. Through the commander's binoculars, the fields appear empty, but the earth trembles amid a deep rolling vibration rising from the mist. Then faint shapes begin to emerge from the haze. Dozens of them. Green silhouettes moving in formation. Shermans. For months, the Germans had laughed at them. Tommy Cookers, they called them, convinced that one Tiger could destroy 5, even 10 of the Allied machines. But here in the bocage of Normandy, the laughter fades. The sound becomes thunder. Hundreds of engines synchronized, relentless. It is not one duel. It is an avalanche. As the first shells scream through the mist, the German crew realizes something too late. It was never about one Sherman. It was about how many were coming. And they are still coming. The story of the Sherman's redemption doesn't begin in Normandy. It begins years earlier, under the harsh North African sun. In 1942, when the first M4 Shermans rolled off American production lines, they were considered modest machines, designed for mass production, simple maintenance, and mechanical reliability, not for glory. Its 75mm gun was decent, its armor sufficient, its silhouette high but practical. It was the tank of a nation that understood war as an industrial contest, not a duel of engineering vanity. To the Germans, this was weakness. They had the Tiger, a mechanical masterpiece with nearly invincible frontal armor, and a powerful 88mm gun capable of piercing anything the Allies fielded. Then came the Panther, faster, sleeker, with sloped armor that could shrug off most Allied shells. These were not just tanks. They were statements, proof of German superiority in engineering and battlefield precision. When German tank crews first encountered the Sherman in North Africa, they saw it as a clumsy, underpowered opponent. The nickname Ronson, borrowed from the lighter that lights every time, captured their contempt. Shermans burned easily when hit, their thin side armor no match for German guns. But beneath the desert dust and humiliation, something else was forming. The Allies were learning fast. Each engagement revealed not only the Sherman's flaws but its strengths: mechanical reliability, ease of repair, and the ability to operate in punishing conditions where German tanks frequently broke down. By 1943 in Tunisia, and later in Italy, Allied armored divisions began to understand their machine. The Sherman wasn't built to outgun the enemy. It was built to outlast him. For every Tiger, the Allies could field 10 Shermans. For every Panther, they could have replacements rolling off ships within days. Still, the perception remained, among Allies and Axis alike, that the Sherman was the inferior tank. Soldiers joked bitterly about being sent to war in a death trap. American crews respected their German adversaries, but they also noted how often enemy tanks were abandoned due to mechanical failures or lack of fuel. The Germans, for all their technical brilliance, were bleeding themselves with over-engineered weapons. Meanwhile, across the Channel, an unstoppable tide was building. Factories in Detroit, Cleveland, and Chicago were running day and night, producing Shermans faster than any weapon the world had ever seen. More than 49,000 would eventually be built, a logistical miracle of steel, discipline, and scale. Each one was a promise that when the time came to retake Europe, the Allies would not run out of tanks, shells, or courage. In contrast, the German war machine was showing cracks. The Tiger's armor was magnificent, but its transmission was fragile. The Panther's gun was devastating, but its engine overheated. Replacement parts were scarce, and Germany's fuel supply was dwindling. Every kilometer of advance now carried a cost. By late 1943, Allied strategists were already planning the invasion that would decide the war, Operation Overlord. The beaches of Normandy would not just test courage, but the entire philosophy of warfare: quality versus quantity, engineering perfection versus industrial scale. When German commanders prepared their defenses, they believed their armored divisions would again dominate the battlefield. They imagined the same duels of the desert, the same burning Shermans scattered across open plains. They didn't yet understand that this time, the battlefield itself, the hedgerows, the fields, the sheer weight of Allied numbers, would rewrite the rules. As the spring of 1944 approached, The Allies were ready to unleash not just tanks but a machine of war powered by industry, planning, and unity. The Germans still thought they would face a familiar enemy. They were wrong. Because what was coming across the channel was not a handful of Shermans, it was an entire armored nation on the move. By May 1944, Europe was holding its breath. In bunkers and staff rooms from Caen to Cherbourg, German officers pored over maps trying to guess where the invasion would strike. Rommel, the desert fox himself, had been tasked with fortifying the Atlantic Wall. He knew the Allies would come, but not when, and not where. Across the Channel in England, the answer was already set in motion. Operation Overlord, the largest amphibious invasion in human history, would land on the beaches of Normandy. Behind the infantry waves and paratrooper drops lay the heart of Allied power, the M4 Sherman. But Normandy was not the desert. Its landscape was a labyrinth, thick hedgerows, narrow roads, small stone villages, and fields boxed in by earthen walls. Perfect country for ambushes. The German panzer divisions dug into this terrain, believed the tight conditions would nullify Allied advantages. They would wait, let the Shermans come into range, and destroy them as they had before. That was the plan. The Allies, however, were no longer the same force that had stumbled through North Africa or Sicily. Months of training in Britain had created an army that fought as a system. Shermans were not lone gladiators. They were part of a combined arms organism. Each tank advanced with infantry support, artillery on call, engineers ready to breach obstacles, and fighter bombers circling above. When the first Allied waves landed on June 6, 1944, the Sherman tanks came ashore on every major beach: Omaha, Utah, Gold, Juneau, and Sword. Many drowned in the surf before they could fire a shot, but enough made it inland to establish a foothold. From there, the armored push began. In the days that followed, the Germans quickly realized something they hadn't accounted for: the scale. The Allied command was landing hundreds of Shermans each day. Within a week, over 600 tanks were operating in the Normandy sector. For the first time, the German armored divisions faced not a series of isolated clashes, but a continuous tide. Every destroyed tank was replaced within hours. Every position overrun was reinforced. Rommel was among the first to recognize the danger. In reports to Berlin, he warned that Allied air power and logistics were turning the battle into a war of attrition that Germany could not win. He wrote, "If we do not stop them at the beaches, we will lose the war in France." But stopping them was impossible. Allied naval guns dominated the coastline. Their fighter bombers, the dreaded Typhoons and Thunderbolts, prowled the skies, hunting any tank that dared move by day. German armor, meant to fight in open maneuver warfare, was being suffocated in a cage of hedgerows, mud, and constant bombardment. Still, the German tank crews fought with ferocity. Panthers and Tigers inflicted heavy losses wherever they appeared. Their guns tore through Shermans with terrifying precision. In isolated battles, they continued to prove their technical superiority. Yet every victory felt hollow, because more Shermans kept coming. To the Germans, this was bewildering. The battlefield seemed endless with Allied armor. Destroy one column and another would appear behind it. Outflank a platoon, and artillery would rain down from unseen batteries. The Sherman's reputation, mocked for years, and was quietly being rewritten, not by propaganda but by persistence. It was the tank that never stopped showing up. By late June, the hedgerows of Normandy were echoing with the grinding metallic chorus of 1,000 tank engines. Towns like Caen, Bayeux, and Saint-Lô became names written in smoke and fire. The German defenders still believed they could hold, that their superior tanks could halt the advance. But the numbers were tilting beyond comprehension. Behind every Sherman in battle, there were 3 more waiting on ships in the Channel. Behind every burned-out hulk, factories across the Atlantic were already building replacements. And as German commanders began to grasp this, that they were no longer fighting just soldiers but the full weight of Allied industry, their confidence began to erode. Because in Normandy, the question was no longer whose tank was better. It was whose army could endure longer. To understand what happened in Normandy, you have to see it through the eyes of those who sat inside the steel beasts themselves. For Allied crews, the Sherman was a paradox, both a savior and a coffin. The men who drove and fought in them knew its weaknesses intimately. The thin armor that could ignite when hit, the high silhouette that made it an easy target. and the gun that often couldn't penetrate the front of a panther or tiger. But they also loved it for what it gave them: mobility, reliability, and a fighting chance every single day. The engine started every morning. The radios worked. The spare parts arrived. And when one Sherman went down, another could take its place. Tankers learned to fight smart using coordination and speed instead of brute strength. They called for artillery, maneuvered through cover, and relied on teamwork to survive. For German crews, the world inside their tanks was very different. A Tiger's interior was cramped, hot, and deafening, but it was also a fortress. Every shot from its 80mm gun thundered like divine punishment. They believed they were unstoppable, trained to trust their armor and firepower absolutely. Yet in Normandy, even the most confident crew began to feel surrounded. There were too many targets, too much smoke, too little fuel. The endless drone of Allied aircraft above made movement a nightmare. German tankers started to fear not just what was in front of them, but what they couldn't see. The next squadron of Shermans waiting beyond the hedgerow. The next bombing run overhead. In every field, in every shattered village, young men sat in machines that defined their fate. For the Allies, the Sherman became a symbol of endurance. For the Germans, their armored pride turned into a heavy burden. Too few, too precious, too vulnerable to sustain. On paper, the Sherman looked unremarkable. A 75mm gun? Later upgraded to 76 or a British 17-pounder in the Firefly variant. Armor no thicker than 75mm at its strongest points. A gasoline engine prone to catching fire when pierced. It should have been outclassed by the Tiger's monstrous armor and gun. Yet in Normandy, technology alone didn't decide battles. Adaptability did. The Sherman could traverse terrain the Panthers struggled with. Its narrower tracks and lighter frame made it less likely to break down in mud or soft soil. Its turret turned faster, allowing Allied crews to react quicker in ambushes. The Sherman's gyro stabilizer, primitive but effective, let it fire more accurately on the move, while German tanks often had to stop to shoot. Then came innovation born of necessity. Allied engineers fitted many Shermans with Cullen's hedgerow cutters, crude metal prongs welded to the front to slice through the dense Normandy bocage. This gave them mobility where German armor couldn't follow. In the chaos of close-quarter fighting, that difference meant survival. The Germans' technological edge was undeniable, but it came at a cost. Panthers and Tigers were masterpieces, but fragile ones. A broken track, a damaged transmission, or a lack of spare parts could sideline a vehicle for days. A Tiger consumed almost 5 times the fuel of a Sherman, and Germany had none to spare. Meanwhile, Allied mechanics could rebuild a damaged Sherman overnight. Recovery vehicles hauled wrecks back to makeshift depots, and within 24 hours they were fighting again. The Germans often had to abandon their tanks simply to keep moving. Technology, in the end, favored the flexible, not the flawless. In every major encounter during the Normandy campaign, the same pattern emerged. German tanks inflicted terrifying losses in the opening hours. But as the day went on, the tide shifted, not through luck but through method. The Allies didn't fight tank versus tank. They fought as a network. Each Sherman unit advanced with infantry at its side, protected by artillery and aircraft on call. Radio communication between units and air controllers became the Allies' invisible weapon. The moment a German tank revealed itself, coordinates were relayed, and within minutes, rocket-firing Typhoons or P-47 Thunderbolts appeared overhead. The Germans had no such coordination. Their tanks were deadly but often isolated, moving without adequate infantry support or communication. Their commanders relied on individual brilliance rather than systemic unity. Normandy punished that philosophy mercilessly. At Villers-Bocage, famed German ace Michael Wittmann ambushed a British column and destroyed over a dozen vehicles in minutes. It was a display of pure tactical mastery, but even he couldn't stop what followed. Wave after wave of replacements converging from every direction, until his position was surrounded and overrun. That was the difference. The Germans fought battles. The Allies fought a war system. Each destroyed Sherman was simply a part of a greater flow, one that could not be stopped by skill or armor alone. As the hedgerows filled with smoke and fire, one truth was beginning to take shape. Superiority had lost its meaning when faced with scale. The men inside the tanks were still fighting bravely, the machines still roaring to life each dawn. But behind every engine rumble was a larger question that would soon define the rest of the campaign. Could elite precision ever withstand the power of overwhelming coordination? Leadership during the Battle of Normandy was not just about courage, it was about perspective. The contrast between Allied and German command philosophies was as sharp as the difference between their tanks. For Germany, armored warfare had always been the domain of tactical genius. Commanders like Erwin Rommel and General Leo Geyer von Schweppenberg were veterans of blitzkrieg. Fast, decisive operations designed to outmaneuver and annihilate. But Normandy offered none of the open maneuvering they once mastered. The hedgerows, the air supremacy of the Allies, and the constant logistical pressure crushed the blitzkrieg spirit before it could even begin. Rommel had argued for a defensive doctrine: destroy the invasion at the beaches before Allied numbers could build. Berlin disagreed. Hitler insisted on holding armored divisions in reserve, waiting for the real landing that he believed would come at Pas de Calais. By the time he released those forces to Normandy, the Allied beachheads were secure and Shermans were already pouring inland. The Allies, under leaders like Montgomery, Bradley, and Patton, operated differently. Their philosophy was methodical: advance a mile, consolidate, and then advance again. They fought a grinding war of attrition, fully aware that every day favored them. Their supply lines were vast, their fuel plentiful, and their air cover constant. Montgomery's strategy around Caen and Bradley's breakout at St. Lo weren't dramatic in the blitzkrieg sense. But they achieved something the Germans could not: sustained, coordinated pressure. The Allied commanders understood that overwhelming logistics could win where firepower could not. German generals grew increasingly desperate. They launched counterattacks, Operation Epsom, then Lüttich, but each was blunted before it began. Their command structure, constrained by Hitler's direct interference, could no longer adapt. The genius of maneuver warfare had been shackled by ideology. Leadership on both sides faced impossible choices. But only one side had the resources to survive their mistakes. Before Normandy, German tank crews carried an aura of invincibility. Their training, equipment, and battlefield record had made them legends. They were the elite, and they knew it. But as June turned to July 1944, that confidence began to fracture. Reports from the front described an endless enemy. For every Allied column destroyed, another appeared by nightfall. Fuel shortages left many tanks stranded, forcing crews to blow up their own machines to prevent capture. For men raised on the belief that German engineering guaranteed victory, the realization was devastating. The Sherman, once mocked, had become a symbol of relentless persistence. German soldiers began referring to them bitterly as Heuschrecken, locusts, because they seemed to swarm endlessly across the countryside. The psychological impact went both ways. Allied crews who once feared the sight of a tiger began to learn how to counter them, by working in teams, coordinating fire, and calling in airstrikes. They no longer saw the German tanks as gods of war, but as beasts that could bleed. Captured German soldiers often expressed disbelief at the sheer scale of Allied supply. One reportedly said, "When we destroy one, 3 take its place. When we kill a crew, another steps in before the turret cools." That realization, that their enemy's strength was not mechanical but industrial, broke the spirit of many veterans long before their tanks were destroyed. In contrast, Allied morale grew stronger with every push. The Sherman, for all its flaws, was a tank soldiers could trust to move, to fight, and to bring them home. And in war, trust is everything. The Battle of Normandy wasn't just a test of weapons, it was a moral crucible. It asked a haunting question: what is the cost of victory when won by overwhelming numbers? The Germans had built their war on the myth of technical perfection. Every Tiger tank, every Panther was a masterpiece of craftsmanship, but also a monument to inefficiency. Each one took months to build and drained resources from a collapsing economy. The Allies built theirs on the principle of necessity. The Sherman wasn't perfect, but it could be produced by the thousands. Factories could churn them out faster than Germany could destroy them. In the end, war favored not the artist, but the engineer. There's a quiet tragedy in that. Many of the German tank crews who died in Normandy weren't fanatics. They were soldiers defending a belief in mastery and precision that no longer belonged in modern war. They faced an enemy whose strength wasn't in individual heroism, but in collective endurance. When historians later studied Normandy, they found something profound buried under the statistics and wreckage. The moment when warfare shifted forever. From this point on, victory would belong to the side that could sustain, not just strike. For the Sherman, Normandy was not redemption through glory but through inevitability. It didn't need to be perfect. It only needed to be there again and again, until the enemy had nothing left to fight with. And as the battle reached its boiling point in late June, that inevitability was about to break the German front open completely. The sound of engines grew louder with every passing day. The fields of Normandy were no longer fields. They were the throat of a machine grinding toward the future. And soon, in one decisive moment, it would break wide open. Normandy, late June 1944, the hedgerows are burning. The rain has stopped, but the air is still thick with the stench of fuel and scorched wheat. On the outskirts of Caen, the battle for control of Normandy's heartland reaches its peak. German armor, remnants of the 12th SS Panzer Division, Hitlerjugend, the 21st Panzer, and elements of the Panzer Lehr Division have dug in around the city. They are veterans hardened by years of warfare. Across the fields the Allies are coming, and they are coming in waves. June 13, 1944. British forces of the 7th Armored Division, the famed Desert Rats, advanced toward the small town of Villers-Bocage. Their Shermans and Cromwells move along a narrow road, unaware that one of the most feared tank aces in the German army, SS Hauptsturmführer Michael Wittmann, waits nearby in a tiger eye. At 8:30 a.m., the trap is sprung. Wittmann opens fire. Within minutes, British tanks and half-tracks are burning. His Tiger alone destroys more than a dozen vehicles before withdrawing. For a moment, the legend of German tank superiority seems reborn. The news spreads through the ranks, the Tiger still reigns. But what happened next revealed the deeper truth. The British regrouped. Within hours, they returned with reinforced armor and air support. Typhoon fighter bombers roared overhead, strafing German positions. The town, and eventually Wittmann's unit, were encircled. The tactical brilliance of one man could not withstand the systemic might of the Allied war machine. The Germans had won a moment, but the Allies were winning the war. 2 weeks later, British and Canadian forces launched Operation Epsom, an attempt to outflank Caen and break the German line. Montgomery's men faced some of the most elite armored units Germany could muster. The Desecu SS Panzer Corps, including the 9th and 10th SS divisions. The fighting was brutal. Rain turned fields into swamps. Visibility was near zero. Sherman struggled through mud while German guns pounded from the tree lines. For days, neither side gained ground, but the Germans paid a price they couldn't afford. Every tank lost was irreplaceable. Every destroyed Panther was one fewer to hold the line. Allied logistics, meanwhile, flowed endlessly. Fuel, ammunition, and replacement tanks arrived by sea each night. By June 30th, the Germans had thrown everything they had into counterattacks and failed. Montgomery's bridgehead was intact. Caen remained contested, but the illusion of German dominance was shattered. For the first time since D-Day, Allied commanders realized the enemy's armor could be bled dry. In headquarters bunkers across northern France, the truth dawned slowly and painfully. The Wehrmacht's panzer divisions were fighting not just soldiers, but a machine that never stopped moving. Rommel's reports grew darker with each passing week. He warned Berlin that the enemy's material superiority is overwhelming. He described columns of Shermans advancing under an umbrella of artillery and aircraft, saying, "Every movement by day is instantly spotted and attacked. We cannot move without air cover, and we have none." The battlefield no longer rewarded tactical brilliance or elite craftsmanship. It rewarded whoever could sustain constant pressure, whoever could replace losses faster than the enemy could inflict them. For the Germans, Normandy became a nightmare of exhaustion. For the Allies, it was a slow, grinding path toward inevitable victory. Every hedgerow was a fortress. Every village was a killing ground. Shermans advanced yard by yard, their tracks clawing through mud and rubble. Infantry followed, clearing out anti-tank teams and hidden guns. When a Tiger appeared, the Allied crews called in artillery or airstrikes. The battlefield was no longer defined by duels. It was defined by coordination. In this labyrinth of greenery and fire, the Sherman evolved. Crews learned to use smoke shells for concealment, to flank rather than face head-on, and to exploit the terrain instead of cursing it. The Germans, however, were running out of room to adapt. Every movement risked detection from the sky. Allied reconnaissance planes traced every tank column. Air controllers directed strikes with terrifying precision. By mid-July, some German divisions had lost over 60% of their armor. The myth of the indestructible tiger was collapsing under the weight of logistics, exhaustion, and air power. By the end of June 1944, the German front was still holding, but only barely. The commanders knew what was coming next. The Allies had concentrated overwhelming force for a single massive breakout. And when it came, it would not be a battle. It would be a storm. By late July 1944, the German defensive line in Normandy had stretched to its limit. Caen had finally fallen after weeks of brutal fighting. The Allies now turned their attention west, toward the narrow corridors leading out of the Normandy hedgerows and into open country. The operation was codenamed Cobra. Its objective to smash through the German front near Saint-Lô and open the road to Brittany and Paris. The plan was simple and terrifying in scale. Before the ground assault began, the Allies unleashed nearly 3,000 bombers over a tiny stretch of front. Waves of B-17s, B-24s, and medium bombers turned entire sectors into a living inferno. German troops, already exhausted and undersupplied, were buried in the explosions. Roads vanished. Tanks were flipped like toys. Communication lines ceased to exist. When the bombardment stopped, the ground shook with the roar of engines. Thousands of Shermans, supported by infantry and engineers, rolled forward through smoke and debris. The German line, once disciplined, formidable, and deadly, simply disintegrated. The Germans tried to counterattack, but there was no order left. Panthers and Tigers were trapped in craters, immobilized by bomb damage. Others were ambushed by Sherman platoons advancing from multiple directions. Every field, every crossroad became a choke point. It was no longer a duel between tanks. It was annihilation through momentum. Within 48 hours of Cobra's launch, the Allies achieved what months of earlier fighting could not: a decisive breach. German resistance began to crumble. The Panzerlehr Division, once considered one of the best equipped in the Wehrmacht, ceased to exist as a fighting force. Its remnants scattered under relentless pressure. Shermans flooded through the gap. Dozens, then hundreds, then entire armored columns. The speed of the advance stunned both sides. German anti-tank crews barely had time to set up before they were overrun. Villages that had been German strongholds for weeks fell within hours. By July 30th, the Allies were moving faster than German command could react. Bradley's forces pushed south and west. Patton's newly activated Third Army poured through the breach, and Montgomery's northern thrust fixed the remaining German units in place. The once proud panzer divisions, their fuel gone, their radios silent, their morale shattered, were retreating in chaos. Many tanks were abandoned not because they were destroyed, but because there was nothing left to fight with. As the German front dissolved, the Allies saw their chance to finish it. By early August, the retreating German forces were being herded into a shrinking pocket between the towns of Falaise, Argentan, and Chambois. What followed was one of the most catastrophic defeats in German military history. Tens of thousands of soldiers, hundreds of tanks, trucks, and guns were trapped in a narrow valley, pounded from the air by Allied aircraft, and shelled relentlessly from the ground. Shermans lined the ridges overlooking the pocket, firing into the chaos below. It wasn't battle anymore. It was a slaughter. Columns of German armor burned for miles. The once invincible Tigers lay smoldering beside horse-drawn wagons, symbols of an army collapsing into the past. Rommel himself, gravely injured in an air attack, was no longer in command. His replacements could do little but watch as their forces disintegrated. When the smoke finally cleared in mid-August, nearly 50,000 German troops were dead, wounded, or captured. The panzer divisions of Normandy, once the pride of the Reich, were gone. The road to Paris was open. For German survivors, the truth was undeniable. The Sherman, the tank they had once dismissed as inferior, had outlasted them. It wasn't faster. It wasn't stronger, but it had never stopped coming. For Allied crews, the victory was bittersweet. They had lost friends, watched tanks burn, and learned that courage alone did not guarantee survival. But they had also witnessed something greater: the power of unity and coordination over individual superiority. In the fields of Normandy, the myth of German armored invincibility was buried beneath thousands of wrecks. The world had seen the future of warfare, and it belonged to those who could combine mobility, industry, and intelligence into one unstoppable force. As the Allied columns rolled east toward Paris, the sight was unmistakable: endless lines of Shermans and engines rumbling, flags fluttering, crews exhausted but unbroken, advancing through the countryside once ruled by the Tiger. The battle had changed everything. From that moment on, German commanders no longer spoke of defeating the Allies. They spoke of surviving them. And for the first time in the war, even the most loyal tank crews began to whisper a thought that had once been unthinkable. Perhaps the war was already lost. By the end of August 1944, Normandy was no longer a battlefield. It was a graveyard of steel. The countryside that once echoed with the thunder of engines now lay silent, littered with burned-out husks of armor. Shermans and Panthers side by side in the hedgerows told the story without words. One represented endurance, the other extinction. The numbers were staggering. In just 2 months of fighting, the Germans had lost over 1,500 tanks and assault guns in Normandy, the equivalent of their entire armored strength in the West. The Allies had lost roughly the same number of Shermans and other vehicles, but the difference was in what came next. By the time German crews were burning their last reserves, new Allied tanks were already landing at Cherbourg. The production lines in America never stopped. The German war diary entries from this period are striking in tone. Once confident, now resigned. Commanders lamented that the enemy has endless supplies. One officer from the Panzer Lehr Division wrote bitterly, "We destroy 5, 10, 20 of his tanks and still they come." Even Hitler's high command could no longer ignore the catastrophe. When reports from Normandy reached Berlin, generals who had once mocked the Sherman as obsolete now spoke of its true power, not in the thickness of its armor, but in the depth of the system that supported it. For the Wehrmacht, the loss went beyond machinery. It was psychological. For years, the German Tank Corps had been the embodiment of national pride, the spearhead of blitzkrieg, the proof of Aryan technical mastery. Normandy shattered that image. The Allies had turned their supposed weakness, the simplicity of their machines, into an unbeatable strength. Each Sherman destroyed was a lesson learned, each replacement an improvement. By the time the Germans realized this, it was far too late. And yet, for all its triumphs, the Sherman's victory came at a cost. Allied tank crews paid dearly for every kilometer gained. Entire platoons vanished in the smoke and fire of the hedgerows. Veterans recalled the horror of seeing their comrades trapped inside burning tanks, the acrid smell of gasoline and metal filling the air. But they also remembered something else, the feeling of momentum. The knowledge that despite every loss they were pushing forward, breaking through, driving an enemy that had once seemed invincible. That momentum was contagious. It rippled through the Allied armies, from infantrymen to airmen to commanders at every level. For the first time they felt not just victory but inevitability. As the Allies advanced across France, German soldiers who once manned the mighty Tigers now found themselves fighting on foot, retreating toward the Seine. The Panthers' era of terror had ended not with a climactic duel, but with exhaustion and surrender. In every ruined village, every field filled with wrecks, the lesson was clear. In the industrial age of warfare, quantity, coordination, and resilience would always defeat isolated brilliance. The Germans had built machines to win battles. The Allies had built a system to win the war. By September 1944, Paris was liberated. The remnants of the panzer divisions limped east toward the German border, never to recover their former strength. The Tiger and Panther would fight again, at Arnhem, at the Bulge, in the ruins of Berlin, but never as the unstoppable force they once were. Because after Normandy, the myth of invincibility had burned away, replaced by the cold, unyielding truth of modern war. And at the center of that truth, still rolling across France in endless lines, was the Sherman. As August gave way to September, the full scale of the German defeat in Normandy became undeniable. Entire divisions had ceased to exist. Thousands of prisoners marched west under Allied guard. The once proud 7th Army, which had defended the beaches with ferocity, was now little more than a broken remnant scattered across France. For the Allies, victory in Normandy was more than a military triumph. It was a turning point in the psychology of the war. The myth of the German panzer as an invincible force had collapsed under the sheer persistence of Allied firepower and organization. The Sherman, mocked, underestimated, often despised even by its own crews, had proven itself in the crucible of the hedgerows. But this victory did not come easily, nor was it without bitter lessons. Reports from the U.S. First Army and British Second Army revealed the enormous human cost. Tank crews suffered some of the highest casualty rates of any branch. The average life expectancy of a Sherman crewman in Normandy was measured in weeks. Many never survived their first engagement. Those who did spoke of constant tension. Every sound, every shadow, every corner of a hedge could hide a German gun. Yet despite that, morale remained astonishingly high. What kept them moving wasn't just discipline, it was belief. They believed in the mission. They believed in each other. And perhaps most of all, they believed that their sacrifices meant something larger. That every burned-out Sherman on a country road brought the war one day closer to ending. For the German tankers, the aftermath was something different entirely. Disbelief and despair. Veteran crews who had fought since Poland and France in 1939 could not comprehend how their elite units had been broken so completely. Many blamed the chaos of command, the shortage of fuel and ammunition, the overwhelming Allied air power. Others simply accepted what they had seen. A machine that, though individually superior, could not stand against a force that never stopped coming. The Panzerwaffe had been built on a dream of perfection. The Allied system crushed it with reality. Even German civilians hearing the news from Normandy began to understand what their soldiers could not say aloud. The Reich's armies were no longer advancing. They were retreating on every front. And if the Allies could break them in France, the question became not if they would reach Germany, but when. For the Allies, the victory unleashed a momentum that would carry them across Europe. By the end of the summer, Patton's Third Army was racing toward the German frontier. Supply lines strained to keep up. French resistance groups joined in open rebellion. Town after town celebrated liberation. In every column that rolled through those streets there were Shermans, sometimes patched, often scarred, but always moving. The tank had become more than a weapon. It was a symbol, a moving embodiment of Allied endurance and industrial will. Its success reshaped how future wars would be fought. Military planners across the world took note. The age of the super tank was over. Victory belonged to those who could produce, adapt, and coordinate, not just design. The German Tiger and Panther would live on in legend, their silhouettes etched into memory, their fearsome reputations preserved in stories and museums. But history would remember something else too, that they had been defeated not by better armor but by better strategy. Normandy taught the world that war was not won by the strongest but by the most relentless. When the guns finally fell silent in 1945, the Sherman's legacy was everywhere. From the beaches of Normandy to the streets of Berlin, from the deserts of North Africa to the islands of the Pacific. Over 49,000 had been built. Many would serve for decades after the war in Korea, in the Middle East, even into the 1970s. It was never the best tank, but it was the right tank, built for the kind of war the world had truly become. And in that truth, buried beneath the ruins of Europe, lay the final victory of the Sherman. In the quiet fields of Normandy today, it's hard to imagine the thunder that once tore through the earth. The hedgerows stand calm again. The village is rebuilt, the fields green with life. But beneath that calm lies the memory of a summer when the world changed, not through brilliance or invention, but through persistence. The Germans had believed that war could be won by superiority, that a few perfect machines, a few elite divisions, could overcome any enemy. For years that belief had held true. From Poland to France to the steppes of Russia, their panzers had carved history in steel. But in Normandy that illusion ended. Here the Sherman, mass-produced, mechanically simple, sometimes clumsy, taught the world a different kind of power. The power of scale, of coordination, of men and machines working together in relentless rhythm. Every Sherman that burned was replaced. Every fallen crew was honored by those who followed. It was not a story of one tank being better than another. It was a story of what happens when a nation, when entire nations, unite behind a single purpose. That was the true victory in Normandy. When the German soldiers faced not a handful of enemies but thousands, when every village brought another wave of tanks, another wave of courage, they saw, perhaps for the first time, the meaning of modern war, not the duel of heroes but the sum of systems. And as the Allies broke through and rolled across France, they proved that courage, multiplied by coordination, becomes something unstoppable. The Sherman did not win the war alone, but it carried the weight of it, mile after mile, battle after battle, until the road led not just to Paris but to Berlin. Even now, the rusting shells of those tanks still rest in Normandy's fields, silent monuments to a lesson that reshaped warfare and history alike. that in the end endurance defeats perfection, and the world's most inferior tank became the symbol of ultimate victory.